before I give a quick biography of Said, I just want to introduce Davey. So, Davey doesn't go to Oxford. He is 17. I first met Davey when he was in year 9? Year 9, 10. When he came to philosophy club at our school and presented on the invention of private property.
Locke, Proudhon, Nell,
Rousseau, right?
Yes,
I remember you concluding with Rousseau. And he's here to sort of introduce Said to the extent to which we can all have a conversation about Said, to sort of equalize. Some people might have read a bunch of Said's work, other people might have only really heard the name in conversation, but his job is to sort of give a bit of grounding so that we're all, when we say the term Orientalism, speaking about the same thing, which is really important for a conversation. So a bit about Said before I stop speaking. Said is commonly known to be sort of the father of post-colonial theory, post-colonialism. He was born in 1935, died in 2003. He is a Palestinian Arab Christian who spent most of his life in America teaching at Columbia, which is interesting. I think I'm the first person to say that philosophers' biography shouldn't be sort of attached too stubbornly to their philosophy, because I think we need to create some space there. But that is definitely something we should take into consideration when talking about Orientalism. His principal influences were Foucault, Gramsci, and Adorno, and that's about it. Without further ado, let us welcome warmly Davey.
So I'm completely unqualified to be here. Hence my opening question is very non-academic and asking how many of you have seen the 1992 film Aladdin, a cartoon? The majority of you, if not all of you. Okay, that's my starting point. On the basis, I did initially start with this kind of very long history of Oriental thought, kind of chronologically through the book, and English is far too long and far too dense, and nobody wants to hear basically another lecture. So my starting point is going to be Aladdin. On the basis, what do you think about Aladdin? Because now apparently, if you go on Disney Plus and you click on it, there's like a disclaimer from Disney saying it is a racist film. Just to clarify, it's a racist film. Please do watch it, but it is a racist film. And that's because ultimately Western animators, on grounds of a loose interpretation of Arabian Nights, which in turn is a loose interpretation of Arab folklore, created this sort of film relying on Oriental tropes. Jafar, this dangerous Oriental character who's despot, wanting this lamp, so it's very materialistic and stuff like that. It's set in this mythical Middle East, which is very far off. It's timeless. It could be pretty much anywhere. Pretty much every part of the film relies on what I like to call Orientalism. I'm just exploring this small talk, although frankly I don't know how long I'm going to go on for. But it treats the Orient as this homogeneous land. I don't think it ever specifies exactly where it is. I mean, loosely meant to Baghdad, and it's this weird, exotic, dangerous backwater essentially it's set in. It glamorizes this kind of nice space, the costumes are really nice, it's very colourful, it's exotic, but it also kind of barbarizes it and treats it like a dangerous place. There's a line from the film which literally says, "It's barbaric, but hey, it's hung." I mean, it's insane. And Zaid, I think that's the pronunciation, I'm pretty sure, says that Orientalism, the Aladdin is an example of Orientalism. Because a brief definition I have on this handout for a brief kind of summary of Orientalism, but it's the dominant cultural representation of the East as perceived from the West, more or less. It's about how the legacy of colonialism, legacy of colonial thought, in terms of how we represented the Oriental, which, well, naturally now is a racist term, but that could pretty much encompass anything from Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, the Far East, even the Maori and the Pacific Islands. And it says basically that it presumes this sort of cultural Western superiority, where the Western is the norm and then they're all exotic and different and weird in comparison to Western norms and values. And thus the Orient is presented as backwards, inferior, primitive, irrational, violent, despotic backwater. And in this case, the Arabian Nights, they're unable to author a view about it. As in, the Arabs themselves are unable to create a film like Aladdin. It requires this Western animator to come in and tell them their own story of Arabian Nights, right? Like you have Hollywood come in to do a film based on Arabian Nights. I mean, it's kind of insulting almost. It's like, I can't remember of like a Western example, but it's like a Chinese industry coming to do in like, what's a British like archetype, like Merlin or something, I don't know. But something like that, so something like that. And, but for the film, because the Middle East was able to create this cultural representation for themselves and able to produce their proper like history and preserve their golden orient with the Arabian Nights, the West had to kind of come in and speak for them. Essential quote I'm going to kind of link back to is a quote from Marx. They cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. I don't understand the context when we're saying this. I mean, I tried to Google it, but the Marx on wall page was just like so long, I couldn't be bothered reading all through it, to be honest. But it's like a central quote in the Zaid's book, which will come back later. But crucially, Orientalism's thesis is built upon these other figures and in movies like this. He doesn't reference that in the book, but I'm going to reference some of the figures he references before I get into kind of history behind Orientalism. So the first person I want to reference is Arthur Balfour. If you all knew, if you know anything about Palestine, you probably know about the Balfour Declaration. We don't care about that. The point is, he was Prime Minister of England, of the UK rather, between 1902 and 1905. In this period, I think after this period, a foreign minister or something, he had to get up and to kind of speak, because there was, in 1903 I think it was, the Entente Cordiale was signed between France and Britain, and it basically said, France, Morocco, Britain, I think Egypt, and Parliament was kind of haranguing him for this or something, and saying, why are you occupying Egypt? Are you not aware of their great history? Like, surely they are equal to us, or something along those lines. And he gets up and basically manages a cognitive dissonance, saying, oh no, we preserve, they're a fantastic civilization, great classical civilization, but simultaneously we were occupying them. And its basic logic is the fact that, well, hang on a moment, I agree that classical Egyptian civilization is fantastic, new, interesting. But it can't be the modern Orientals, the modern Egyptians. Look at them, they live in tents in the Nile and they don't know what, they don't know anything. So it requires an equally good British Empire to come in and essentially preserve the grand history of Egypt for themselves. It requires a Westerner, like Aladdin, coming in and telling the Orient how to run its own business and what the Orient is, what Egypt is, etc., etc. And so the relationship, I quote here, the relationship between the Occident, I think it's how it's pronounced, and the Orient is a relationship of power, of domination, and varying degrees of a complex hegemony. And the quote Zaid has about Balfour is that his logic is interesting, because, quote, England knows Egypt. Egypt is what England knows. England knows Egypt cannot have self-government. England confirms that by occupying Egypt. For the Egyptians, Egypt is what England knows. Foreign occupation and Egypt for Egyptians is also what England has occupied and now governs. For occupation, therefore, becomes the very basis of contemporary Egyptian civilization. Egypt requires, indeed insists upon, British occupation. So you can simultaneously manage this strategy saying, great civilization, yet still need the British. And this links into another thing I want to talk about, who Zaid also talks about. I have Burton and Marx on there. Fortunately enough times we've got Burton. Marx, at a small, I think 2 pages, but a really resonant thing that hit with me was me talking about Marx. Because, everyone's Marx. Revolutionary figure, humanistic, ahead of his time. But when you're talking about the Orient, when you talk about India and the British occupation of India in particular, his initial sympathies are denouncing colonial exploitation and basically genocide, etc., etc. But then he kind of takes a step back and actually manages to justify the British occupation of India by basically saying India is like an Asiatic economy, and therefore Britain has to come in and make a capitalist economy in order to become a socialist economy. So in part, it's a vindication of the socio-economic thesis that capitalists must get away to socialism, communism, etc., etc. But also, the way he was talking about an Asiatic economy and the Oriental character and stuff like that, it's baked in with what we like to call Oriental discourse. If you're familiar with Michel Foucault, Zaid basically steals Foucault and just applies it. Yeah, it does. And the point is, the very vocabulary Marx had at his disposal to talk about India and the Orient was caused by this long legacy and long scholarship of Oriental scholars talking about, writing about, speaking for the Orient, authoring views about it, writing scholarship about it, and thus the very vocabulary and ideas he had at his disposal was limited. It was limited by colonialism. It was limited about what the scholars who learned the languages and authored the papers about it had to say about it. And thus, the limits of his language, the limits of his knowledge were limited to his languages, like Wittgenstein says. And that's another quote here. In using Marx as a case by which a non-Orientalist human engagements will first dissolve, then usurp the Orientalist generalizations, we find ourselves having considered the process of lexicographical and institutional consolidation peculiar to Orientalism. What was this operation by which, whenever you discuss the Orient, a formidable mechanism of omnicompetent definitions would present itself as the only one being suitable for the discussion? He only had access to this narrow vocabulary. So regardless of that fact that he sympathized with Egypt over the Indians, he still had to somehow justify the colonial exploitation of India. And to unpack this and unpack why this is happening, we have to go back to two thinkers. Okay, I'll see it. Sassi and Renan. I don't know much about them, to be honest. I kind of read about the book, but they seem quite complicated, and there's not much information about them elsewhere. But Sylvester Sassi in particular, he wrote these anthological excerpts of Arabic literature, because he he learned Arabic, went out to the Orient, and essentially just compiled all the Arabic literature he could find, and translated it, and he had the notes on there, and he basically tried to kind of interpret it for a Western audience. Similarly, Ernst Renan, he started the philology of Arabic, so he compiled dictionaries, he went along, defined the parameters of these languages, and he started a scientific study. Something along the lines of, he manages to characterize Aryan languages and Semitic languages, and then argues that Aryan languages are inherently superior and thus the people are superior, whereas Semitic languages are violent and whatever, and thus inherently inferior, something like that. And so these were two French philologists who through their study of Semitic languages, started to create the necessary institutions for this discourse. They defined the parameters of the study, they taught its first generation of students, they began to make certain generalizations about the East and Islam, and thus they only did that by resurrecting these classical Oriental languages, many classical Oriental languages, in order to better understand the past and thus kind of patronize the present. And thus, a quote from Zaid, Orientalism can be discussed and analysed as a corporate institution for dealing with the Orient, dealing with it by making statements about it, offering views about it, describing it, teaching it, setting over it, ruling over it. In short, Orientalism is a style of Western style for domination, destruction, and having authority over the Orient. It's the discourse that Renan and Sassi first create and institutionalize about the articulatable, can't say that word, in order to talk about these Orient as the sign rather than signify. Also here, it might be noted in the handout, Zaid makes it very clear that even prior to this, there was a history of Orientalism, going back to antiquity, particularly kind of the Romans and Greeks and Persians. Also in the Renaissance, Dante, the Herbalo, Shakespeare, I think Muhammad's and Dante's 8th Circle of Hell or something like that. And that's also the first colonial encounter with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. Have you seen the Napoleon film, the new one by Ridley Scott? You know when he shoots that cannon at the Sphinx? It's terrible, it's genuinely a terrible film. But when he was going on his invasion of Egypt, he brought along 160 savants who basically compiled a bunch of information about modern day Egypt and basically taught how the French how to occupy it. This is history, culture, people, whatever, thousands of pages of tomes, French, this is what you have to do about it. So it's a long history, and it first rises with the colonial encounter, but he stresses that it was also in place before the colonial encounter. This continues basically until World War II. I had more Massignon, Gibbs, and other thinkers to talk about. I had to kind of skip them because we did a practice run in the cafe and it was 37 minutes. So I've had to cut a bunch already, and I'm okay, this is fine. But I'm going to skip to World War II. On the basis of World War II, a shift starts to occur. And this is because France and Britain, i.e. the two centres of Oriental study, get replaced by the United States. So European scholars after World War II or during go to the US and bring in the discourse and the vocabulary and the ideas already had. But also it gets changed in the sense that Anglo-American Orientalism ultimately starts as a social scientific discourse. I don't know if you say classics or you know what classics is. But Orientalism was basically that, but for the Orient. But then with the US, it's more the fact that someone's trained as an economist and thus learns Oriental languages, and then they become an Orientalist. They don't start out as an Orientalist. But this Arab figure becomes a really omnipresent caricature in post-World War II discourse. I mean, just think about it, the post-colonial revolutions, particularly post-Cold War, particularly post-9/11, the Arabs characterized like the robes, headgear, traditional dress, or like the character of incompetence and defeat and malice, or like some Arab shape with like gasoline pump. The quote, like Edward Said points out that, quote, it is only a slight overstatement to say that all Muslims and Arabs are essentially seen as either all suppliers or potential terrorists. He kind of brushes over like the actual humanity of them and just kind of focuses on them being relative to the West. And like particularly in Edward Said's time, he published this in 1978. He was at Columbia. 3 years before that, the Columbia Course Guide on Arabic said that every other word in Arabic is violent, as like have violent connotations. Like that was like 3 years before it was published, and they're basically saying Arabic is a fundamentally violent and despotic language. Similarly, I kind of make a point here. Like you can say about the Islamic mind, the Oriental character, like post like Iraq War, for example, there's been interviews with US soldiers, and they're constantly talking about an Arab mind. The Arab mind only stands false. And yet, if I would ever say something like the Jewish character or the black mind or something like that, you would rightly say that it's racist. Because there's running racist tropes, there's running racial stereotypes. And yet you kind of get away with saying, oh, the Oriental character, the Arab mind, whatever. We're going to get away with that because Orientals or whatever, and Arabs and Muslims are sort of seen as like normalized racism, basically. I also want to talk about a guy called Bernard Lewis. He was Zaid's nemesis, more or less, genuinely. They had back and forth, the entire book is saying why you were wrong, and genuinely hate each other. But he was like the right-hand man of Dick Cheney, basically. Like post-Iraq, he literally was like, so this is the Middle East, yeah, I know the Middle East. But this is the point, it's a sort of Westerner, basically saying what this Middle East is because he studied languages and knows the history. And it's a great quote, a great passage rather, it was like when you're talking about the, I don't know how many of you actually speak Arabic. Any of you speak Arabic? Okay, never mind. I may be going to butcher the pronunciation, Thawra or something. It's like the Arabic word for revolution. And he tries to go the etymology of it. And he says, well, it's from like the word for like rise up or excitement, which then it can like compares to a camel rising up. It's a bit weird. And then he says, and he brings two uses of it. First was in this idiom, waiting till excitement dies down. So he compares revolution to waiting till excitement dies down. And then he also compares it to like this rise who talked about how revolutions are terrible and the French Revolution is completely unjustified because you should never have revolutions against governments and stuff like that. So he basically kind of like mansplains revolution, saying no, it's inherent in the language you can't have revolutions in the Arab world. And the last 60 years kind of go, yeah, not the case, really quite the opposite. I mean, to be honest. But the point is, you have like this figure who is omnipresent in Dick Cheney's administration and forming the Bush White House over how to approach Afghanistan and Iraq, who is essentially an Oriental scholar, but is just saying whatever he wants to say, more or less. I'm going to brush over this as well. I've pretty well gone off quite a lot of time already, and I'm going to try and briefly sum up American Orientalism before I talk about what I really want to talk about today. But the point is, even American Orientalism still has the same dogmas as European Orientalism. The fact that there's this like fundamental distinction between East and West. The West is rational, supreme, and developed. The East is undeveloped and abhorrent. The fact that they're still able to revive classical texts in order to try and inform about how the modern Orient is, in order to justify their imperialism. The fact that it's like the Orient is something like is uniform, it's incapable of reform, etc., etc. But yeah, I mean, there's this same strip of Orientalism going throughout history, although there's many variations of it, not all of which I've explored today because I don't have time. But the real thing I want to get onto, which I find particularly is the fact that Zaid particularly takes issue with the boundary between East and West. Because as he says, the boundary notion of East and West, the varying degrees of projected inferiority and strength, the range of work done, the kind of characteristic features ascribed to the Orient, all these testify to a willed imaginative and geographic distinction made between East and West and lived through many centuries. So when I first started reading Orientalism, I generally thought his prescription was, okay, right, so if a Westerner talks about the Orient or Middle East or whatever, he's in the vocabulary of colonialism and thus can't talk about it. Gotcha. So then should he just Arabs can write about Arab history and then Indians about Indian history and then problem solved? He doesn't believe that for one, and secondly he said, no, we can still have fundamentally cross-border multicultural studies. He's just saying the fact that you need to be aware of you could be aware of how that's come to constitute it. This boundary between East and West. Because he basically says that although all East and West are artificially constituted, they still have to be real. They're a real cultural imagination. There may not be he's not like, are you familiar with like the distinction between sign and the sign and thing signified? He's only interested in sign. So he's interested in rather than the real true Orient, he's interested in the cultural representation of it. So he argues that, I've been arguing that the Orient is itself a constituted identity, and the notion that there are geographical spaces with indigenous, radically different inhabitants who can be defined on the basis of some religion, culture, or racial essence proper to that geographical space is equally a highly debatable idea. I certainly do not believe the limited proposition that only a black person can write about black history, a Muslim about Muslims, and so forth. Yet at the same time, he goes on to say the fact that you've got to be acutely aware of the kind of underlying biases that he brings to the table when addressing it. There are limits to the vocabulary, limits to the discourse. But at the same time, I also read over the summer Peter Frankopan's The Silk Roads, and this Western, British aristocrat man, basically writing history of the world from the perspective of the Middle East and Central Asia. And he manages to really celebrate those cultures, while also, I argue, using Oriental tropes. But still, he posits the Middle East and the Orient and the Near East as the fundamental driving force of history. And he manages to kind of connect the fact that the West is actually connected to the East, etc., etc. That Judaism, Christianity, Muslim, and Islam developed in tandem with each other. So I really kind of argue the fact that, okay, what's the limit here? So you'll be aware of the division East and West, and you're also going to be aware of, say, how you're bringing to the table the discourse. But you still can talk about it. Zaid, in the last 30 pages of his book, kind of elaborates on this, but to be honest, I don't think his answer is sufficient. He basically says that we should be able to kind of attack this distinction between them and us, but we can't undo it, because ultimately there's still political and intellectual undercurrents defining this boundary. But we can still rethink it, and he says that my aim was not so much to dissipate difference itself, for who can deny the constitutive role of nations where the cultural differences and relations between human beings, but to challenge the notion that difference implies hostility, a frozen reified set of opposed essences, and a whole adversarial knowledge to attack those things. What I called for was a new way of conceiving the separations and conflicts that have simulated generations of war, hostility, and imperial control. And that's what he's aimed here. He's trying to understand the limits of the discourse and to move past it. I'm reading Foucault, and I really get frustrated with Foucault over, okay, you're saying this, what do we do about it? You're posing this protocol, what do we do about it? You're saying science can have an objective, okay, then how do we have some scientific discourse? Similarly, if knowledge is discourse purely, how do you overcome the discourse if you're stamped with imperialism? And so that links to the question of what comes next now. And his last line in the afterword it's my last quote, trust me, bear with me, I've got another quote, I've got some more quotes in the handout as well. But he says that although the animosities and inequities that exist from which my interest in Orientalism as a cultural and political phenomenon began, there is now at least a general acceptance that these represent not an internal order, but an historical experience whose end, or at least partial abatement, may be at hand. Looking back at it from a distance afforded by 15 years and the availability of massive new interpretive and scholarly enterprises to reduce the effects of imperialist shackles on thought and human relations, Orientalism at least had the merit of enlisting itself openly in the struggle, which continues, of course, in the West and the East together. He's been aware of his biases and moving on, and he says that he makes clear he's not attacking Oriental discourse. There's a guy called Abu Harani who wrote the History of the Arab Peoples. He is a British Lebanese historian. He is great, profound scholarship. He wrote to Zaid saying that I accept your thesis, but surely we can still have some form of scholarship on the East. Surely this is a necessary field of knowledge. How do we then overcome it? Because essentially when Zaid published his book, it did hit critical acclaim, and it basically destroyed the reputation of Oriental study forever. I know at Oxford, it was only a few years ago, that you had to change Oriental studies into Asian and Middle Eastern studies, something like that. And the fact that, I remember walking past the Institute this morning or something, or this afternoon, and seeing it's still called up the other side, Department of Oriental Studies. It's still controversy about that. But still, arguably that is a necessary part of the field of knowledge, so why can't we have it? And Zaid was very clear that he didn't want to tarnish the work of actual scholars, humanistic scholars even also. But then what's the difference? This is the thing, I don't understand how he says these scholars can be objective or at least semi-objective and escape their subjectivity and escape the discourse. something that discourse grounds them. How do we kind of move past that? Similarly, he's a father of colonialism, as Seb said, and he makes a distinction between postmodernism and post-colonialism, saying the fact that postmodernism attacks the grand narratives, but post-colonialism accepts these grand narratives and tries to reconstruct them. And that's a key focus of post-colonial studies. There's also the read component, and it's my last point before I finish. Thank you for bearing with me like 25 minutes or some terrible amount of time. But he ignores social and economic realities. One of my best friends is Arab, but he's also half Italian. And he basically, he likes Orientalism, in part because ultimately he is a sentinel, like his family is Arab elites, as it were. So he was when he learned about it, he was able to say, oh, the West is oppressing me by destroying my culture and distorting the false cultural representations. And I was like, you have a point, but you're an Arab elitist in Kuwait. You're a part of the problem. Don't you see that? You are part of the problem. And this is the point here. By ignoring socio-economic elements and the material elements of colonialism and just looking at culture, it's really kind of undermining the vast impact and vast legacy of colonialism. I assure there's a problem there. So by focusing only on the culture and the aesthetic, sure they're emboldening the elite to basically become their oppressed. Davey does admit that Orientalism basically caused a bunch of sort of authoritarian regimes in the East to basically accept the thesis and go, oh, we can blame everything on the West now, look at us. Orientalism, they can't attack us, they can't critique us, they can't point out our human rights violations or anything. Because ultimately they're just Orientalists rather. And he made that point, but this is the issue, there's still this, he concedes all these points in the afterword, but the afterword's in 30 pages. He never really answers them. So for the last 3 minutes, sorry I've gone over, what do you think? What was the set? There's a bunch of questions in your handout, but yeah, I'm done.